On a fog-drenched evening in November 1945, just after sunset, a man in a tan trench coat moved briskly through Lafayette Square, the silhouette of the White House looming behind him as if watching. His fedora sat low over his brow, obscuring his face from the occasional passerby who, if they noticed him at all, would assume he was another government worker heading home. But he was not heading anywhere except to a weathered green bench tucked between a barren tree and a cast-iron lamppost whose flickering light failed to cut through the mist. In his right hand, he carried a worn brown leather briefcase, its surface scratched, its handle frayed, the kind of object invisible in plain sight. He checked his wristwatch once, then again, before finally placing the case gently on the bench, as if afraid to wake something sleeping inside. A single glance over his shoulder, and then he vanished into the swirling fog, his footsteps muffled by the damp gravel beneath him. Inside that briefcase, wrapped in butcher paper and bound with string, were a series of photographs no civilian was ever meant to see. Meticulously photographed schematics of America's newest and most terrifying creation, the atomic bomb. Impossibly detailed diagrams, handwritten calculations, annotations bearing military-grade security markings, each image a weapon in itself. The drop was silent, unnoticed, unremarkable to the city moving around it. But that briefcase would change the balance of global power, not with the roar of a detonation, but with the quiet snap of a camera shutter in a lab thousands of miles away. The man who had left it behind was not a general, not a politician, not even a scientist. He was a courier, a messenger in a network of betrayal that stretched from Los Alamos to Moscow. And he hadn't done it for glory or even conviction. He had done it, at least at first, for $500, passed to him in crumpled bills from the hand of a man who called himself Yakov. That briefcase was collected 10 minutes later by another man, tall, bearded, thick-framed glasses, his expression unreadable. He lifted the case without hesitation, as if he were retrieving forgotten lunch, and vanished into the opposite end of the park. The park would close in an hour. The bench would be wiped down by a groundskeeper. No one would ever know. But in the months that followed, Soviet physicists would examine the photographs under dim lamplight in the secure halls of Artemis 16, cross-referencing with their own designs, and realize the Americans had handed them the roadmap. 4 years later, a mushroom cloud would rise over the Kazakh steppe, and the United States would no longer be the only nation with the power to end the world. And it all began here, in a park, with a briefcase, and a man who vanished into fog. Harry Gold didn't look like a man who could change the world, and maybe that was his greatest weapon. Short, soft-spoken, with a permanently apologetic smile, and eyes that darted down when anyone met his gaze, he was the kind of man people barely remembered after talking to. But behind that unassuming exterior was a mind of precision and compulsion, the kind that cataloged every word, every date, every face. And behind that, a man who would become one of the most damaging couriers in Cold War history. Born Henryk Golodnitsky to a poor Jewish immigrant family in Philadelphia, Harry spent his youth absorbing the dogmas of the working class, surrounded by whispers of exploitation, injustice, and Soviet salvation. His father believed in labor unions, his friends flirted with communism, but Harry, he believed in usefulness, in doing something that mattered. And when he found himself working as an industrial chemist during World War II, with vague ties to research labs connected to military contracts, that opportunity to matter came knocking not with threats or promises of glory, but with a simple offer. Would he be willing to carry a few messages? It started in 1940. His friend, a Soviet sympathizer named Tom Black, introduced him to a contact, a man from the NKVD who never gave a full name. The pitch was vague. They needed someone to deliver packages. No questions, no details, just trust, discretion, and obedience. Harry said yes. Not because he was ideologically devout, though he convinced himself he was, but because he finally felt seen, valued. He became a ghost on the train routes between American cities, ferrying documents from brilliant, disillusioned scientists to Soviet cutouts in safe houses, parks, and bus depots. He memorized faces. He perfected the art of being invisible. And when the Manhattan Project began to gain momentum, Harry Gold found himself at the heart of the greatest intelligence theft in modern history. Through his connection with Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working at Los Alamos, gold became the artery through which secrets flowed: schematics, memos, formulae, diagrams of implosion devices, and yield projections. In quiet apartments in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, in dusty safe houses in New York and Philadelphia, Harry Gold moved secrets that would compress the Soviet timeline by years. But to hear him tell it later, it wasn't about sabotage. It was about fairness. Why should one country hoard a weapon of unimaginable power? Why should the Soviets, the great bulwark against fascism, be left defenseless? Yet for all his lofty justifications, the payments kept coming. First 500, then more. He bought new shoes, paid debts, took his mother to a nicer apartment. The line between principle and profit blurred with every envelope. And yet, through it all, he still saw himself as harmless. Just a messenger, just a man who hated secrets. But in truth, Harry Gold was a man whose every delivery helped drag the world closer to the brink of annihilation. The recruitment of Harry Gold did not happen in some smoky back room or under the shadow of a darkened alleyway, but in a perfectly ordinary cafe on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, the kind of place where the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the espresso machine blended into a steady hum that made private conversations feel invisible, which was precisely why Soviet intelligence favored it. Gold had been nursing a cup of weak coffee, reviewing chemical notes from work, when a man slid into the seat across from him without asking, a man with a foreign cadence to his English and an air of casual confidence that felt out of place in the modest cafe. And though Gold would later insist he had no idea who this man was, it's impossible to ignore how quickly the stranger dismantled his defenses. He began with flattery, how valuable Gold's intellect was, how the scientific community in Europe admired American industrial progress, how men like him were underappreciated by the capitalist machine. And Gold, who had spent his entire adult life feeling like a supporting character in everyone else's story, felt the uncomfortable warmth of being seen, perhaps for the first time. The stranger introduced himself only as Mr. Raymond, a name so plain it practically advertised deceit. But he wielded ideological rhetoric with a softness that made it feel more like a moral invitation than a recruitment pitch, speaking of the Soviet Union as an ally in the global fight against fascism, of shared scientific destiny, of the tragedy of knowledge locked away behind military classification when humanity itself was starving for progress. But beneath the philosophizing, a quieter, more cunning probe emerged. Questions about Gold's finances, about the lingering debts from the Depression, about the medical bills his family struggled with, about how unfair it was that brilliant men like him earned so little while corporations profited off their labor. Gold felt the sting of truth because it wasn't coercion, at least not overtly, but rather the insinuation that he deserved more from life. And when Mr. Raymond finally leaned forward and lowered his voice, the entire tone shifted from ideological debate to clandestine proposition. There were documents, he said, technical memos and research papers, nothing dangerous, nothing that would harm Americans, just scientific information that allies should share in the name of global stability. And all Gold would need to do was borrow them briefly, photograph them discreetly, and return them without anyone noticing. In exchange, there would be compensation, not a fortune, but a gesture of gratitude. $500, delivered in cash, no questions asked. Gold's heart pounded because he knew what this was, yet the offer felt strangely rational, almost benevolent, framed as a way to correct injustice rather than commit espionage. And as the stranger stood to leave, placing a matchbook on the table with a date and time inside, Gold stared at the writing, as if it were a doorway to a life where he finally mattered. He told himself he was helping an ally. He told himself he was advancing science. He told himself he had no choice. But the truth was simpler, sharper, more dangerous. He needed the money, and for that price he was willing to open a path from American laboratories straight into Soviet hands. By 1943, Harry Gold's role had expanded beyond anything he'd ever imagined when he first accepted that quiet farmer in a Philadelphia cafe. What had started as a favor, a few innocent errands in the name of ideology or equality, had transformed into an untraceable lattice of espionage, a courier web carefully constructed by Soviet intelligence that threaded through American research labs like veins feeding a heart in Moscow. And Gold had become the blood that moved through them, unnoticed, essential, and wholly infected. He never met the others face to face. He didn't have to. He was a cipher in motion, a middleman trusted for his reliability, not his charisma, a man who could be handed a plain envelope or a roll of undeveloped film and would never question its contents, never open the seal, never speak out of turn. One of his most consistent sources was Klaus Fuchs, the quiet, brilliant German-born physicist working on atomic implosion designs at Los Alamos, whose disdain for the fascism that had overtaken his homeland made him receptive to Soviet appeals for balance in the post-war order, and whose secrets would pass through Gold's corns on their whilst to handlers in the Bronx or Queens. The names in the network blurred. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, David Greenglass, Morris Cohen, some working out of guilt, others for money, some for politics, others because they could not resist the thrill of doing something forbidden in the name of something greater. But Gold never needed to know their motives, only the times and places, and the passwords whispered on street corners or passed on through coded letters written in sympathetic ink, all of it orchestrated with surgical precision by Soviet agents whose mastery of dead drops, brush passes, and anonymous signals turned American cities into a grand chessboard of betrayal. Sometimes Gold would retrieve microfilm hidden inside a hollowed-out bar of soap. Other times, he would deliver blueprints folded inside stacks of old newspapers. And once, in a move that terrified him, even as it thrilled him, he slipped a packet of neutron density equations into a baby's stroller during a chance encounter in Central Park with a Soviet diplomat disguised as a tourist. The money came in envelopes, always small, always in cash, always quiet. And it was just enough to help his mother with rent, to pay off his loans, to keep the refrigerator full when his chemistry job paid too little and demanded too much. He kept no records, asked no names, and told himself he wasn't a traitor. He was just a facilitator of truth-sharing between equals, a believer that science belonged to mankind and not to military cabinets or war profiteers. But behind that belief was a quiet, choking dread he never acknowledged, a feeling that somewhere down the line someone would look into the mirror of history and see his fingerprints smeared across every formula that led to global arms escalation and every radioactive isopol cloud that ever bloomed over a desert, a city, or a battlefield. The secrets Harry Gold delivered were not just ink on paper, they were mathematical detonators, intellectual fuel for a bomb the Soviets hadn't yet figured out how to build, a blueprint for destruction that had taken American scientists billions of dollars and tens of thousands of hours to perfect, now condensed into photographs, sketches, and handwritten notes that fit inside a plain manila envelope or the false bottom of a shaving kit. The crown jewel of this espionage wasn't the simple design of a gun-type atomic bomb, which the Americans had already tested over Hiroshima, but rather the far more complex and devastating implosion-type device, which required an intricate understanding of high explosive lensing, symmetrical detonation, and neutron initiators. What Fuchs gave Gold, and what Gold carried to Soviet hands, were the very equations that had puzzled Stalin's own physicists for years, calculations for the critical mass of plutonium, neutron scattering cross-sections, compression ratios, and lens geometry, all of it written in a tidy, scientific hand by someone who had walked through the halls of Los Alamos and touched the very heart of America's most secret weapon. One of the most valuable documents passed was a detailed description of the X unit, the electronic triggering system that coordinated the simultaneous detonation of high explosive lenses around a plutonium core, a breakthrough that had taken the U.S. years to achieve, but which allowed the Soviets to skip months, even years of trial and error. There were sketches of the Fat Man bomb casing, notes on implosion test results, and even reports on the Trinity test in New Mexico, including observations on yield, fallout dispersion, and crater morphology. Data so precise that Soviet scientists at Artemis 16 would later joke that they had watched the American test without needing to leave their lab. Perhaps most crucial of all were documents detailing failures, the problems encountered in early implosion attempts, the corrections that followed, the theories that didn't pan out, because in the world of high-stakes physics, knowing what not to do is often more valuable than knowing what works. The Soviets, armed with this goldmine of intelligence, abandoned their cumbersome uranium designs and reoriented their entire bomb program around the implosion method, compressing years of theoretical guesswork into a narrow, accelerated window of development. And on August 29, 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima and 3 years ahead of American estimates, a flash of white light tore across the steppe near Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, and a mushroom cloud roared into the sky. The Soviets had the bomb, and the world order changed overnight. U.S. analysts were stunned, unable to comprehend how the USSR had achieved what should have taken them another half-decade, and only in the months that followed, as investigations began to untangle the sheet. Threads of betrayal, did the scope of the espionage network come into focus? And at the center of it, not with a detonator or a stopwatch, but with a satchel and a train ticket, stood Harry Gold, the man who had handed the Soviets the future one document at a time. On the morning of August 29, 1949, in the remote steppes of northeastern Kazakhstan, near the desolate testing grounds of Semipalatinsk, a brilliant white flash lit the horizon like a second sun, followed by a towering column of fire and dust that spiraled into the sky. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, and within hours, American reconnaissance aircraft equipped with airborne radiological sensors flying over the North Pacific detected anomalous readings in the upper atmosphere, radioactive isotopes, specific to nuclear fission, drifting eastward on high-altitude winds. Back in Washington, those readings triggered immediate concern at the Atomic Energy Commission, and by the time a formal report landed on President Truman's desk, it confirmed the unthinkable. The United States was no longer the sole possessor of nuclear weapons. Panic rippled through the intelligence community, and across the Pentagon, physicists, analysts, and military strategists alike struggled to comprehend how the Soviets had closed a technological gap that American officials believed would last at least until 1953. Some claimed it was sheer scientific brilliance. Others suggested a freak success. But in hushed rooms, the possibility of espionage gained traction, and questions turned toward Los Alamos. Who had access, who had motive, and who had been passing information through invisible channels no one had thought to trace? Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, the test, codenamed First Lightning by the Soviets, RDS-1 by engineers, was hailed as a monumental victory, proof that the USSR had reached strategic parity with its capitalist rival. And Stalin, famously stoic, reportedly cracked a rare smile during the briefing, though he also demanded immediate action to identify and protect the intelligence channels that had made the success possible. The bomb itself was a near clone of the American Fat Man device dropped over Nagasaki, and that was no coincidence. It meant blueprints had been obtained, test data examined, and American scientific debates overheard by ears that should never have been listening. As the shock settled in, the United States began an aggressive internal review of its atomic security systems, launching Operation Venona, which involved cryptanalysis of Soviet communications and reopening dormant counterintelligence files that had once seemed too minor to matter. But now, every whisper of communist sympathy, every unaccounted-for lab visitor, and every unexplained absence became grounds for suspicion. The realization dawned that this hadn't been a single leak, but a systemic hemorrhage, one that had gone unnoticed for nearly a decade, facilitated not by dramatic betrayals in smoky boardrooms, but by quiet, seemingly harmless men who ferried secrets in lunchboxes and hollowed books. One of those men was Harry Gold, but in 1949, his name was still unknown to federal investigators, his face unmarked by any wanted poster, and his role in the Soviet atomic timeline nothing more than a ghost's footprint. For now, all Washington knew was that a storm had broken across the nuclear age, and somewhere, someone had handed the Soviets the keys to Armageddon, and it was only a matter of time before that someone slipped up. Klaus Fuchs had always been a man of extraordinary intellect but limited guile, a physicist whose theoretical brilliance made him invaluable to the Manhattan Project but whose face betrayed too much when pressed. And in late 1949, just months after the Soviet atomic test stunned the world, British counterintelligence quietly picked him up outside Harwell Laboratory, asking only for a brief conversation, which turned into hours, then days, and finally a confession. The trail had begun with decrypted Soviet cables, part of the secret US-UK Venona project, that hinted at a highly placed mole inside the atomic program. And though names were coded, code names like Rest and Charles began to draw lines toward Fuchs. At first, he denied everything, insisting his loyalty to Britain and science was absolute. But when confronted with transcripts and patterns he couldn't rationalize away, the defenses cracked and the facade dissolved. He admitted he had been passing information to the Soviets since 1942, and with weary resignation, he gave up the name of the man who had ferried his documents to Soviet handlers, Harry Gold. Across the Atlantic, the FBI mobilized immediately, placing Gold under quiet surveillance in Philadelphia, watching his movements with increasing unease as the threads began to connect. He had no criminal record, no known affiliations, lived modestly, almost invisibly. But the deeper they dug, the more the coincidences piled up. And on May 23, 1950, Harry Gold opened his apartment door to find federal agents waiting with a warrant and a dozen questions he wasn't prepared to answer. For a man who had spent nearly a decade as a courier in the most dangerous intelligence network in American history, Gold folded quickly, perhaps too quickly. And once inside the interrogation room, his terror did the talking before he could think of how to hide. Within days, he was naming names with a kind of mechanical precision, listing meetings, locations, contacts, drop sites, signal methods, and routes, all from memory, all without hesitation. As if the years of secrecy had weighed so heavily on him that confession now felt like relief. His statements were gold mines for the Bureau, and from his words unraveled the rest of the tapestry. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, David Greenglass, and a constellation of others whose low-level access and quiet loyalty to the Soviet cause had gone unnoticed during the war, but now burned in the spotlight of treason. Gold told them about parks and trains, about microfilm and toothpaste tubes, about packages exchanged without eye contact, about envelopes filled with money and notes burned after reading, a universe of betrayal tucked inside the rhythms of ordinary life. His cooperation was total, but it wasn't born from ideology or guilt. It was fear. The bone-deep panic of a man who had lived too long in the shadows and now faced the sharp clarity of consequence. And as the web unraveled, the American public was introduced not to a monstrous traitor, but to a meek man with round glasses and trembling hands, whose quiet obedience had helped the Soviets build the bomb, and had never, finally, detonated the network that made it possible. Harry Gold sat in the witness box under the dim lights of the federal courtroom, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his voice soft but unwavering as he recounted years of espionage that had slipped past American defenses, not through violence or coercion, but through brown envelopes, whispered exchanges, and promises sealed with nods. The courtroom was packed, prosecutors, defense attorneys, journalists scribbling furiously. And behind Gold, a nation watching, horrified to discover that the man who had helped deliver America's most guarded nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union didn't fit the image of a hardened traitor. He looked more like an accountant, or a librarian, or someone's quiet uncle. The prosecution built its case not around ideology, but money, not around loyalty to the Soviet cause, but the transactional banality of treason for pocket change. And when pressed on his motive, Gold famously answered, "It wasn't about money, it was about duty." And yes, the 500 helped, a line that echoed with tragic absurdity, as if the price of upending the global balance of power could be equated to the cost of a month's rent and groceries. The trial of Harry Gold in 1950 was not a grand spectacle like the one that would follow for the Rosenbergs, but it was deeply significant. His complete cooperation, his chillingly detailed confessions, and his willingness to name every contact without resistance painted a damning portrait, not just of himself, but of the entire network he had served, and the defense, limited in its options, leaned on character, emphasizing that Gold had never profited lavishly, had never asked for more, had lived modestly, and never strayed from his job or family obligations. But prosecutors hammered the symbolic weight of his betrayals. The fact that secrets handed over in exchange for a few $100s had allowed a rival superpower to build a weapon capable of leveling cities, and that no amount of remorse could undo the irreversible. In the end, the court spared him the death penalty, citing his complete and early cooperation, and instead sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison, a term that stunned some observers who had expected a harsher fate for a man whose actions had indirectly armed Stalin's nuclear arsenal. But Gold's usefulness as a witness could not be ignored. His testimony was instrumental in the investigation and prosecution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, as well as David Greenglass and others whose espionage careers would have otherwise remained buried in silence. In prison, Gold was a model inmate, quiet, studious, helpful, and he rarely spoke of his past except when summoned for further testimony, always delivering his statements with the same clinical detachment that had made him such a reliable courier. And yet, behind that placid demeanor lingered the unbearable irony that for all the global chaos his actions had unleashed, for all the headlines and broken trusts and shifting balances of power, the man who cracked the nuclear monopoly of the West had done it over and over again for just five. Not millions, not promises of escape or power, just the price of a decision he could never take back. In the years that followed Harry Gold's sentencing, the ripples of his quiet betrayal became waves that reshaped the 20th century, not only in what they exposed, but in what they set in motion. The theft of America's atomic secrets, enabled by a man paid less than the average factory worker, had done more than hand the Soviet Union blueprints for a bomb. It had collapsed the illusion of security, pierced the arrogance of scientific exceptionalism, and ignited a geopolitical wildfire whose heat would stretch across continents, decades, and ideologies. After the Soviets tested their bomb in 1949, U.S. military policy shifted from dominance to deterrence, from building a single unmatchable weapon to building thousands, then tens of thousands, of warheads in a frantic attempt to stay ahead in what would become the most expensive and dangerous arms race in human history. Billions were poured into uranium enrichment, missile silos, hydrogen bomb research, early warning systems, and civil defense propaganda, all in reaction to the fact that Stalin's scientists had, somehow, caught up far too quickly. And behind every war game, every bunker blueprint, every mushroom cloud drill in American schools was the quiet, invisible memory of a man like Gold passing a folder to a man like Yakov under a park bench or in the stairwell of a New York hotel. The Rosenbergs would die in the electric chair. Greenglass would live in shame and secrecy. Fuchs would be released and return to work in East Germany. But Gold, imprisoned yet not hated, infamous yet forgotten, lived in a kind of moral purgatory. Not quite traitor, not quite martyr, just another man in a beige jumpsuit reading chemistry journals in the corner of a prison library while senators barked on the Senate floor about loyalty oaths and FBI agents tapped phones across the nation. The Cold War hardened like poured concrete, opaque, permanent, and impossible to ignore. And with it came the McCarthy era, the Red Scare, blacklists, loyalty programs, and the widespread belief that anyone, anywhere, could be a spy, a subversive, or a threat. Universities purged left-leaning academics, defense contractors quadrupled background checks, and the line between free thought and suspicious thought grew thinner with every televised hearing. Gold, meanwhile, maintained in letters and interviews that he had never meant to hurt anyone, that he had believed in balance, in peace, in the idea that no one nation should wield absolute power, and in that belief, he insisted, he had acted with moral integrity, though he always added, almost as if reminding himself, that yes, the money had helped, and yes, he had been a coward to say yes the first time, but no, he had not been a villain. Yet to the world outside it didn't matter, because the damage was incalculable, the price was laughable, and the cost, paid in mushroom clouds and cold silences across iron curtains, was generational. Harry Gold never marched into a battlefield, never armed a warhead, never stood beneath the roar of jet engines or beside the blast radius of a nuclear test. And yet, few men of his era left fingerprints on history as consequential as his. He was not a general or a politician, not even a scientist with access to the levers of power, but a courier, a man with soft eyes and a quiet demeanor, who walked between train stations and cafes with a satchel full of knowledge that could vaporize cities, destabilize empires, and send the world into a 40-year paralysis of fear. And the most haunting detail of all was the price. $500 a drop, paid in cash, folded into envelopes, sometimes tucked between the pages of a newspaper, or slid across a cafe table without a word. His work did not make headlines when it was done, only when the consequences exploded into view. And by the time the world understood what had been stolen, the chain reaction had already begun. The nuclear arms race that followed the Soviet bomb was not inevitable. It was provoked, propelled, and perpetuated by information Gold helped transfer, equations and sketches that erased scientific barriers and turned secrets into shared doomsday blueprints. He did not light the fire, but he carried the spark, over and over, from one set of hands to another, telling himself it was for peace, or balance, or fairness, but perhaps never truly believing any of it, or believing all of it, depending on the day. His legacy is not measured in military decorations or monuments, but in a world that built arsenals large enough to end civilization many times over. A world that taught school children to duck and cover, that carved missile silos into cornfields, that stationed submarines beneath polar ice with warheads aimed at strangers they would never meet. And in the footnotes of that legacy, buried beneath the names of presidents and premiers, beneath treaties and tests and terrifying near misses, sits Harry Gold, the man who carried secrets in his coat pocket and changed the geometry of power on Earth. He died quietly in 1972, released from prison, living under an assumed name, working in a hospital lab. No parades, no protests, no speeches, no books written by his hand. Just one obituary in a Philadelphia newspaper noting that he had passed away of natural causes. Age 62, survived by no one, remembered by few. But history does not forget the weight of decisions disguised as errands, nor the violence that can rise from the quietest betrayals. And as the 20th century closed with arsenals still locked and loaded, with sirens tested and launch codes rotated, the truth remained that the world had teetered on the edge of annihilation for decades. And that balance of terror, that doctrine of mutually assured destruction, that global standoff born of suspicion and secrets, had begun not with a declaration of war or the firing of a gun, but with a man who said yes to an envelope and walked away with a bag of cash and a future ablaze. If you found this story as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What would you have done in Harry Gold's shoes? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes history turns on the quietest decisions.